The coastal city of Vulmont lived beneath a ceiling of fog that rarely lifted. It pressed low against rooftops and chimneys, clung to wrought iron balconies, and slid through narrow streets like a living thing that had learned the map by heart. The air carried the scent of salt and wet stone, of rusted anchors and money that had been handled too many times. Vulmont was proud of its facades. It showed visitors polished marble entrances, curated history, benevolent philanthropy. What it never showed was how every elegant building cast a second shadow, longer and darker, where debts accumulated and truths were stored like contraband. The Rowan estate stood close enough to the water to hear the tide at night. It was an old house, expanded and rebuilt over generations, its symmetry carefully maintained while its interior grew increasingly uneven. Windows were tall and narrow, designed more for light than for air. Most of them no longer opened. The reason was never discussed, but the result was unmistakable. The house breathed poorly, as if it preferred to keep its own atmosphere sealed inside. The walls held warmth during the day and released it reluctantly at night, trapping echoes, footsteps, and unspoken rules. Liana Vale lived there without ever truly inhabiting it. She had been given rooms in the eastern wing, far from the grand staircase and the salons used for receptions. The corridor leading to her quarters was longer than necessary, its lamps spaced too widely, creating pockets of dimness where the air felt colder. Doors along that passage tended to close on their own, not with force, but with quiet inevitability. It was the kind of place that discouraged lingering and rewarded obedience. Locks clicked softly. Keys were kept by people who smiled when they carried them. After the fire, no one had asked Liana where she wished to stay. Decisions had been made quickly, efficiently, with the same tone used when discussing repairs or insurance claims. The fire had been described as an accident, a regrettable consequence of old wiring and negligence. The scars it left on Liana's face were treated as an unfortunate but convenient outcome. They explained her absence from public rooms. They justified her exclusion. They turned her into a problem that could be hidden without appearing cruel. In Vulmont, rumors did not spread so much as they fermented. They aged quietly, gaining strength and complexity until they were strong enough to be served as fact. Some said Liana was cursed, that the fire had not been the first incident surrounding her and would not be the last. Others claimed she had seen something she should not have, something involving the port, the ledgers, or the men who came and went at hours when decent people slept. No one could agree on the details, but everyone agreed on the conclusion. She was safer out of sight. Sullust Rowan, by contrast, was everywhere. She moved through the city like a reflection in polished glass, flawless and carefully angled. Her laughter was recognizable, her presence anticipated. She wore the family name as if it were custom-made, and the city responded accordingly. Invitations followed her. Prospects circled her. She was spoken of as an inevitability rather than a choice. At events, people asked after her first, then after her parents, and only rarely remembered there had once been another daughter. Sir Gideon Rowan presided over this arrangement with practiced ease. In public, he was generosity itself, a patron of the arts, a benefactor to hospitals, a man whose handshake promised stability. In private, his authority was exercised through omission rather than command. He did not raise his voice. He simply allowed discomfort to settle until it reshaped behavior. He understood that fear, when managed properly, required very little maintenance. The house followed his lead. Servants learned which corridors to avoid at certain hours. Meals were scheduled precisely, with adjustments made silently when Liana's presence threatened to complicate appearances. Her dinners were often delayed or relocated, framed as logistical necessities rather than deliberate choices. She was expected to understand. Understanding was considered a form of gratitude. On the night of the city's annual charity ball, the Rowan estate filled with music and voices that echoed off high ceilings. Guests arrived wrapped in wealth and expectation, their coats taken by hands that knew how to disappear. Crystal glasses caught the light. Conversations overlapped, carefully casual, circling around investments, alliances, and marriages that would be announced only when advantageous. Liana had been told to wait for her meal in the kitchen, a suggestion delivered with a smile that implied consideration rather than command. She did not argue. She rarely did. Instead, she moved through back passages she knew by heart and slipped into the winter garden. It was one of the few places in the house where the ceiling was glass, though even there the panes were sealed shut. Moisture gathered along the edges, blurring the outside world into streaks of gray and green. Plants grew in controlled abundance, trimmed and trained to never become wild. The air smelled faintly of soil and citrus, layered over the persistent dampness of the sea. Liana stood among the foliage, her reflection fragmented in the glass. The mask she wore softened the outline of her scars, turning them into an abstraction rather than a fact. In the distorted surface, her face looked almost unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone passing through rather than someone trapped. She focused on her breathing, on the quiet rhythm of the tide beyond the walls, on the idea that spaces could exist where no one demanded anything from her. That was when the atmosphere shifted. It was not announced by sound or movement, but by pressure. The garden seemed to contract, the distance between walls subtly reduced. Liana felt it before she saw him, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. The man who entered the garden did not belong to the house, and the house knew it. Adrian Blackwood had arrived with the confidence of someone accustomed to being expected. In the city, his name carried weight even when spoken casually. He was described in different ways depending on who was speaking: duke, industrialist, port owner, royal advisor. To some, he was a necessary ally. To others, a controlled threat. The most honest called him the Wolf of Volmont, a title that acknowledged both his patience and his capacity for violence without ever accusing him directly. He had come ostensibly to select a bride, a spectacle designed to satisfy public curiosity and quiet certain political pressures. Beneath that purpose lay another, less visible objective, one that required proximity, access, and the ability to observe without interference. He moved through the estate accompanied by men who understood how to blend into walls, their presence registered only when needed. In the winter garden, Adrian noticed Liana as one notices an anomaly in an otherwise symmetrical design. She did not fit the narrative he had been presented. She was not positioned for display, nor did she attempt to draw attention. Her stillness was deliberate, practiced. The mask, the scars, the careful distance she maintained from the main house all suggested effort rather than accident. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. His gaze rested on her with a focus that was neither invasive nor kind. It was analytical, attentive to inconsistencies. He saw the way her posture remained guarded even in solitude, the way her eyes tracked exits despite there being none that opened. He understood immediately that whatever had happened to her was ongoing, maintained by structure rather than impulse. For Liana, the sensation was unfamiliar. She was accustomed to being overlooked or judged in advance. This was different. Adrian Blackwood regarded her as one regards a locked door, not with frustration, but with interest in the mechanism. She felt exposed without being diminished, seen without being categorized. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. They remained in that shared space only briefly. Footsteps approached from the hall, voices rising as guests drifted closer. The moment fractured. Adrian turned away as if nothing of consequence had occurred, seamlessly resuming his role within the evening's performance. Liana stayed where she was until the pressure eased, until the garden expanded again into its original proportions. When she finally returned to the kitchen, her meal waited, untouched and cooling. She ate slowly, aware that something in the house had shifted, though nothing visible had changed. Above her, music continued. Laughter echoed. The Rowan estate performed its elegance flawlessly. But somewhere within its sealed walls, a detail had been noticed that could no longer be ignored. Adrian Blackwood moved through the ballroom as if it were a familiar hunting ground disguised as a social event. The chandeliers cast a careful light, designed to flatter faces and soften intentions, but he saw past it easily. To him, the room arranged itself into patterns of need and leverage. Each smile carried a calculation. Each laugh attempted to mask urgency. The music served as camouflage, filling pauses that might otherwise expose desperation. He listened as proposals were presented indirectly, wrapped in pleasantries and lineage. Wealth was mentioned without numbers. Influence was hinted at through surnames and shared acquaintances. Obedience was suggested through tone rather than words. The women surrounding Sullust Rowan blurred into a single composition, distinguished only by variations in fabric and perfume. They spoke with similar cadences, trained to signal interest without revealing intent. They promised continuity, heirs, stability. Everything was predictable. Predictability bored Adrian, and boredom, for a man in his position, was never passive. It sharpened his attention and stripped away tolerance. He had learned long ago that danger often entered a room wearing familiarity. When nothing surprised him, he began to look for what was being hidden instead. He left the main hall without announcement, slipping past conversations that barely paused at his absence. His reputation allowed him that freedom. People assumed his movements were purposeful, even when they were instinctive. He preferred the edges of buildings, the transitional spaces where masks tended to slip. Corridors, side rooms, gardens, stairwells. These were places where truth leaked through architecture. The Rowan estate did not relax in his presence. Its age showed itself in subtle ways. Floorboards that protested weight unevenly, walls that carried sound farther than intended, doors that resisted opening just enough to suggest habit rather than malfunction. Adrian's senses catalogued these details automatically. He trusted structures only after understanding how they failed. He detected the scent before he reached the winter garden. Not flowers, not soil, but tension. The kind that accumulated when people lived under rules they had not agreed to. It reminded him of offices where contracts were signed under duress, of port warehouses where ledgers never quite matched cargo. It was the smell of pressure. Liana Vale stood among the plants as if she had grown there accidentally. She did not perform discomfort or defiance. She simply existed in a space that had not been designed to accommodate her. That alone drew his attention. In houses like this, deviation was either corrected or erased. The fact that she remained suggested value or threat. He observed without haste. The mask she wore did not read as vanity. It was functional, chosen for control rather than concealment. Her posture held a constant readiness, weight balanced, shoulders angled to allow quick movement. The marks on her wrists were faint but unmistakable to someone who knew restraint when he saw it. The scars at her neck were old, healed badly, and deliberately left visible enough to deter questions while inviting speculation. She was a palimpsest of survival strategies. Adrian recognized the pattern immediately. She was not hidden because she embarrassed the family. She was hidden because she knew something that could not be managed once spoken aloud. Knowledge like that required containment. He had ordered the same solution himself more times than he cared to count. He noted her habit of tracking reflections in the glass, using them to monitor space behind her without turning. It was a skill learned through repetition, not paranoia. Her breathing was measured, controlled. She did not startle when he entered, but she adjusted, recalibrated. That told him she had anticipated interruption, not feared it. Sullust Rowan disrupted the moment with perfect timing. Her arrival carried the polished certainty of someone accustomed to being seen. She moved quickly, efficiently, as though she had been monitoring the situation from a distance. Her smile was generous, rehearsed to convey warmth while establishing ownership. When her gaze flicked toward Liana, the warmth vanished. What remained was precise, sharp, and unmistakably territorial. Adrian registered the dynamic instantly. Sullust positioned herself between him and Liana without appearing to do so. Her body language framed the interaction as corrective, an unspoken reminder of hierarchy. She treated Liana not as a rival, but as an inconvenience that had briefly escaped its place. Liana withdrew before escalation could occur. The movement was smooth, practiced, devoid of apology. She did not seek permission or acknowledgement. She simply exited, choosing absence over confrontation. It was not weakness. It was efficiency. Adrian respected efficiency. When she disappeared into the maze of corridors, the winter garden lost its tension. Sullust filled the space with conversation, redirecting attention, offering charm as distraction. Adrian engaged just enough to remain polite. Internally, his focus narrowed. The estate had attempted to show him a display window while concealing the warehouse behind it. That alone justified further inquiry. Adrian had built his influence by dismantling such illusions methodically. He despised being sold a narrative that omitted critical elements. As the evening progressed, he returned to the ballroom, resuming his role. He danced when required. He listened when spoken to. He made non-committal remarks that would be interpreted later according to the listener's hopes. All the while, he catalogued exits, noted which guests avoided which areas of the house, and observed the subtle shifts in staff behavior when Liana's name was mentioned or implied. By the time the final guests departed and the house settled into its nocturnal quiet, Adrian had already decided. The Rowan family required scrutiny, not cursory background checks or polite inquiries. He wanted records, patterns, inconsistencies. He wanted the story beneath the story. That night, instructions were issued with the same calm precision he applied to any acquisition. Financial statements were to be reviewed for anomalies. Property records examined for recent transfers. The fire that had scud Liana was to be reconstructed through permits, insurance claims, and witness recollections. Port activity linked to Rowan interests was to be cross-referenced with reports of missing cargo. And the disappearances from the orphanage on the city's edge, long dismissed as unfortunate coincidences, were to be revisited with fresh attention. Each report, as it returned, reinforced the same conclusion. Liana Vale appeared repeatedly at the margins of these events, never central, never credited, but always adjacent. A name that surfaced too often to be incidental. A presence consistently minimized by official narratives. A liability that had been neutralized through isolation rather than removal. Adrian considered this with interest rather than sympathy. He understood containment strategies intimately. He also understood their limitations. Information did not remain passive indefinitely. It exerted pressure. It sought release. By dawn, Volmont's fog had thickened, obscuring the harbor lights and muting the city's outline. Adrian stood at his window, reviewing the compiled data. The Wolf of Volmont did not rush decisions. He waited until all variables aligned. One thing was clear. The Rowan family was not as stable as it appeared, and Liana Vale was not merely a damaged relative hidden out of shame. She was an unresolved factor in a system already under strain. Adrian adjusted his gloves carefully, a habitual gesture that concealed the faint scars on his own hands. Control, he knew, was not the absence of violence. It was the mastery of timing. And somewhere within the sealed walls of the Rowan estate, timing was beginning to fail. The invitation arrived early, delivered with ceremonial care that contrasted sharply with its underlying intent. It bore Blackwood's seal and language carefully chosen to sound benevolent, almost generous. Liana was invited as an artist, as a distant relative whose talent deserved encouragement. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to neutralize objections before they were voiced. Within the Rowan household, the message landed like a controlled detonation. They could not forbid her from going. Adrian Blackwood was not a man one declined without consequence. Refusal would be read as defiance, and defiance carried costs the Rowans could not currently afford. Their finances were already stretched thin beneath the polished surface, obligations layered over obligations, debts concealed behind charitable donations and social visibility. A public slight to Blackwood would draw attention they had worked hard to avoid. Instead, they reminded Liana of her place. Lady Magunna spoke to her with a softness that felt rehearsed, each word placed carefully to bruise without leaving marks. Her concern sounded maternal, her warnings framed as advice meant to protect Liana from embarrassment. It was the tone reserved for private corrections, the kind delivered behind closed doors where no witnesses could interfere. She adjusted Liana's collar herself, fingers lingering just long enough to assert dominance, reminding her that kindness was conditional. Gideon Rowan maintained his pleasant smile, the one he wore when instructing accountants or dismissing servants. He spoke of reputation, of gratitude, of restraint. He reminded her that she carried the family name and that her behavior reflected upon all of them. The implication was clear. Any misstep would be remembered and repaid later. He did not threaten. He did not need to. Sullust said nothing. She observed from the periphery, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. Her silence was strategic. It communicated resentment without exposing it, hostility without providing an opening for rebuttal. Liana had learned long ago that Sullust's quiet moments were the most dangerous. They meant calculation was undquoi. The carriage ride to Blackwood's residence unfolded in near silence. The city shifted as they moved away from the Rowans district, architecture giving way to wider streets, fewer pedestrians, heavier security. Fog drifted in from the water, wrapping the road in a muted gray that blurred distance and direction. Liana watched the city recede, aware that each block carried her farther from the only life she had known, however constrained it had been. Blackwood's estate rose from the shoreline with an authority that did not seek approval. Stone walls anchored it against wind and tide, their surface unadorned, functional. Large windows faced the water not for beauty but for visibility. The house was positioned like a watchtower, surveying both land and sea. It did not hide. It did not apologize. Inside, the air was warm but restrained. Heat circulated efficiently without excess. Light was controlled, directed to illuminate spaces without softening them. Everything had been chosen for durability and purpose rather than comfort. Security was embedded into the structure itself. Discrete cameras, reinforced doors, corridors designed to limit blind spots. It was not a home built for leisure. It was a headquarters. Adrian Blackwood did not pretend otherwise. He did not soften his demeanor or disguise his intent with charm. When he addressed Liana, it was with the same directness he applied to negotiations and acquisitions. He spoke in facts rather than reassurances. He laid out what he knew without dramatization. He knew about the Rowan debts, the staggered payments disguised as investments. He knew about the pressure Gideon faced from creditors who preferred discretion over legality. He knew that discussions were undquoi to transfer Liana's guardianship under the guise of care, a move that would remove her from the city entirely. He knew that the fire had not been an accident, that records had been altered, witnesses encouraged to forget details that complicated the narrative. He did not express outrage. He did not offer sympathy. He presented information the way one presents inventory, allowing its weight to speak for itself. Then he presented the solution. It was not framed as rescue. There was no suggestion of romance, no appeal to emotion. Adrian proposed a contract. Marriage would provide immediate legal protection. It would remove Liana from the Rowan's control and place her under his jurisdiction, where interference would carry consequences. It would also grant him legitimate access to the Rowan estate, their accounts, their archives, their port operations. He would gain authority to investigate without obstruction. She would gain safety that did not rely on goodwill. The arrangement was efficient. It addressed multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. It created leverage where none had existed and formalized alliances that would otherwise remain tenuous. It was ruthless in its clarity. Liana listened without interruption. Her initial reaction was not fear, but recognition. She had been negotiating survival for years, learning to read intent behind words, to calculate outcomes rather than cling to hope. This was the first offer presented to her that acknowledged reality instead of denying it. Freedom and security were not abstract concepts to her. They were measurable. Freedom meant not being locked away under pretense. Security meant not disappearing quietly when she became inconvenient. Adrian's proposal did not guarantee happiness, but it did guarantee visibility. Under his name, harm done to her would not be ignored. She understood what he stood to gain as well. This was not charity. It was strategic. He needed a reason to dismantle the Rowan operation without alerting them prematurely. Marriage provided that reason. It allowed him to move openly, to ask questions that could not be refused, to apply pressure under the protection of law and custom. It gave him a key to a locked system. The honesty of it unsettled her more than deception would have. There were no illusions to cling to, no promises that might later be withdrawn. The terms were stark, unadorned. She would trade one form of confinement for another, but the second came with defined boundaries and enforceable rules. Liana considered the alternatives. Remaining with the Rowans meant continued erosion of autonomy, increased risk as their desperation grew. Removal under guardianship meant isolation in a place where her disappearance would raise no alarms. Flight without protection meant vulnerability to forces she did not fully understand, people who already viewed her as expendable. Against that, Adrian's offer stood as the only option that did not end with her erasure. Her agreement came without ceremony. It was not fueled by trust or expectation of kindness. It was a calculated acceptance of the lesser danger. The decision settled over her with the cold certainty of a signature placed at the bottom of a document she had read too many times to pretend ignorance. As she left Blackwood's office later that day, escorted through corridors that felt both safer and more restrictive than any she had known, Liana understood the cost of her choice. She had not been saved. She had aligned herself with a man who treated power as a tool and people as variables. In return, she would be protected not because she was cherished, but because she was necessary. For the first time, necessity worked in her favor. Outside, the tide continued its steady rhythm against the stone. The city remained wrapped in fog, unaware that a new contract had been formed within its borders. One that would alter the balance it relied upon to keep its secrets buried. Adrian Blackwood arrived at the Rowan estate in daylight, a deliberate choice that stripped the house of its usual theatrical protection. Morning light was unforgiving. It revealed dust where candles had burned late into the night, wax pooled unevenly on silver holders, faint traces of perfume and smoke that lingered after performances meant to impress. The house smelled of yesterday's celebration and something older beneath it, anxiety disguised as tradition. His presence altered the rhythm of the household immediately. Servants moved faster, quieter, their attention sharpened by instinct rather than instruction. Doors opened without delay. Announcements were unnecessary. Adrian did not need to raise his voice or announce authority. It preceded him naturally, like a change in pressure before a storm. He requested the family to assemble in the main sitting room, the one reserved for formal discussions and carefully curated harmony. The room had been designed to project stability. High ceilings, symmetrical furniture, portraits of ancestors whose expressions suggested permanence rather than warmth. It was a space meant to intimidate outsiders gently, to remind them that the Rowans were rooted, established, unmovable. Liana entered last, positioned instinctively beside Adrian rather than across from him. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, she was not placed at the edge of the room or half hidden behind furniture. Her presence was central, undeniable. The mask remained in place, but it no longer served as an excuse to ignore her. Adrian made the announcement without flourish. He did not frame it as a request or an honor granted. He stated it as fact, already decided, already set in motion. The engagement existed the moment he acknowledged it aloud. The words settled into the room like a fracture spreading through glass. Silence followed, dense and immediate. It was the kind that arrived not because people were stunned, but because they were calculating damage. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch impassively as the family recalibrated. Celeste Rowan was the first to falter. The color drained from her face not with shock, but with realization. This was not a romantic defeat. It was an erasure. Years of preparation, positioning, and expectation collapsed in a single sentence. She had been trained to see herself as inevitable, as the correct conclusion to any negotiation involving status. To be bypassed in favor of Liana was not merely rejection. It was humiliation that rewrote the family narrative. Lady Magana recovered quickly, or attempted to. Her smile formed with practiced ease, but it failed to reach her eyes. Panic flickered beneath the surface, brief but unmistakable. She understood the implications immediately. Adrian Blackwood did not align himself casually. His interest meant scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened structures she had worked carefully to maintain. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening as she calculated which alliances might still be salvaged. Gideon Rowan attempted resistance out of reflex. He leaned forward, posture suggesting reason and concern, ready to frame the situation as a misunderstanding or premature declaration. But the moment his gaze met Adrian's, the effort dissolved. He recognized the boundary being drawn. This was not a negotiation. Any protest would be recorded, remembered, and repurposed against him. Compliance was the only path that did not lead directly to exposure. Liana observed it all with a detached clarity that surprised even her. For years, she had been the variable adjusted to maintain equilibrium. Now the balance shifted around her. She felt it physically, like a redistribution of weight in the room. Fear no longer pressed solely in her direction. It diffused, redirected, settling into new corners. Adrian did not threaten. He did not outline consequences explicitly. He simply clarified expectations. His presence beside Liana functioned as a barrier no one dared test openly. The message was understood without explanation. Harm directed toward her would no longer remain internal family business. It would invite intervention. It would carry cost. The house reacted as systems do under sudden strain. Servants adjusted their behavior first. Eyes lingered where they once avoided. Instructions were followed with greater precision. Respect recalibrated itself around visible authority. The scent of power altered discipline more effectively than any reprimand. Gideon softened. His tone shifted, his gestures becoming more accommodating, almost solicitous. It was not affection that motivated the change, but self-preservation. He began to speak of Liana in terms that suggested value, reframing history in real time. The performance was transparent, but effective enough for survival. Celeste hardened. Her movements became sharper, her expressions more controlled. The loss she experienced did not weaken her. It focused her. The future she had envisioned had been stolen, and she would not relinquish it without retaliation. She began to watch Liana not as an obstacle, but as a target, a problem to be solved. Liana recognized this transformation immediately. She had lived alongside Sullust long enough to read the signs. The danger had not passed. It had evolved. The engagement did not dismantle hostility. It intensified it. She did not mistake fear for respect. She understood that being feared was closer to justice than being puttied, but it was not safety. Not yet. As evening approached, the house settled into an uneasy calm. Adrian departed without lingering, his business concluded for the moment. His absence was felt almost immediately. The protective weight of his presence lifted, leaving behind a vacuum filled with unspoken intent. That night, Liana returned to the eastern wing with heightened awareness. The corridor felt longer than before, its shadows deeper. When she entered her room, she noticed the disruption at once. The arrangement was subtly wrong. Her wardrobe had been disturbed, doors opened and closed with unfamiliar precision. Papers she kept in careful disorder had been shifted, straightened, examined. They had not been searching for jewelry or personal effects. They had been looking for information. Her sketches lay stacked differently, edges misaligned. A drawer containing old notes sat slightly ajar. Someone had been careful, methodical. Someone who knew what to look for, or at least what to fear. Liana stood still, cataloging the changes without touching anything. Her heartbeat remained steady. This was confirmation, not surprise. The engagement had accelerated events exactly as she had expected. The Rowans were not retreating. They were preparing. She restored the room to its previous state slowly, deliberately, committing every alteration to memory. Each movement was an act of control reclaimed. She understood now that waiting for Adrian's protection alone would be insufficient. His influence created space, but she would have to learn to defend that space herself. The house had cracked under the announcement, its internal fractures now visible. But broken structures did not always collapse immediately. Sometimes they adapted, growing sharper edges. Liana removed her mask only after locking the door. In the quiet that followed, she studied her reflection, noting how the scars no longer defined the person looking back. The house could no longer pretend she was invisible. That realization changed everything. The day after the engagement announcement, the Rowan house did not become calmer. It only learned to breathe differently. The corridors still stretched with the same cold patience, the same polished silence, but something had shifted in the way doors closed, in the way footsteps stopped when she approached, in the way staff lowered their eyes too late or too early. It was as if the mansion had accepted a new fact the way old buildings accepted weather. Without agreement, without surprise, only by adjusting its weight and pressure until every crack carried the strain. Liana moved through that pressure like someone who had spent years learning to survive in tight spaces. Her scars had taught her economy. No wasted motion, no careless pride, no open wounds. She had no desire to challenge the house for the sake of proving strength. She only wanted to control the smallest things the way prisoners controlled minutes. When to look up, when to speak, when to sit, when to pretend she did not notice the trap being set. The eastern wing remained her assigned world, but it no longer felt like a cage made by their indifference. It felt like a cage being upgraded because the wrong person had taken interest in the caged animal. From the outside, Volmont continued its familiar performance. Fog rolled in from the sea, low and heavy, clinging to the harbor cranes and the iron fences like wet cloth. The coastal air carried salt and damp stone, but beneath it there was always the city's true scent: old money, rotting wood, and the faint tang of metal that never fully disappeared in places where cargo changed hands in the dark. People in Volmont smiled easily because smiling cost nothing and hid everything. They spoke about charity events and investments the way sailors spoke about storms, with confidence that belonged more to denial than to knowledge. Inside the house, Sullust Rowan began her own performance. She did not rush. She did not storm. She did not throw plates or tear curtains, though Liana could imagine how satisfying that kind of noise would feel to a person like Sullust. Sullust had been trained for a different kind of violence. Her entire life had been shaped into polish, and polish did not crack without permission. She approached Liana with small gestures first, softened eyes, a careful tone, a controlled body that carried no obvious hostility. She chose moments when witnesses existed, but not too many, as if she wanted her kindness to be seen while still looking private. She appeared at the threshold of the eastern corridor with a tray that was almost comically delicate, as though she had suddenly become a sister from a painting. Liana watched the tray before she watched Sullust's face. She watched what was on it and what was missing. Sullust had never brought anything to her before without an audience, and she had never brought anything without a motive. The porcelain cups were thin, expensive, decorated with a pattern that matched the set used in the main dining room. The tea smelled clean, floral, unthreatening. There was a plate of small pastries, the kind guests ate with gloved fingers while pretending hunger was a charming weakness. The scene was carefully chosen. It said family, it said reconciliation, it said the house was not what the rumors claimed. Liana accepted nothing. Not outwardly. She allowed Sullust to enter only because refusing would create a scene, and scenes were currency. Liana had learned that the Rowan household thrived on extracting reactions and then selling them as proof of who she was. A single look of panic would become a story. A single sharp word would become a reason. A single refusal would become ingratitude. So she sat with stillness, the way one sat under interrogation, and let Sullust perform kindness like a practiced instrument. Sullust's voice carried a sweetness that sounded nearly believable, but sweetness could be fermented into poison without changing color. Her hands moved gently, too gently, the way hands moved when they wanted to be seen as safe. She offered small apologies that were not apologies at all, phrases that admitted nothing specific, words that floated around responsibility like fog around a cliff. Liana recognized the technique because she had lived under it for years. It was what people said when they wanted to reset a narrative without admitting guilt. Liana responded with calm neutrality. She did not defend herself. She did not accuse. She did not even soften. The absence of softness was not cruelty, it was instinct. Sullust had always treated softness as an opening. If Liana let herself be relieved, Sullust would step closer. If Liana let herself believe, Sullust would plant something. The more Sullust smiled, the clearer it became what this was about. It was not remorse, it was recollection. Sullust was not trying to become a better sister. She was trying to become necessary. The engagement had taken away Sullust's central position in the family's plan, and a person like Sullust did not accept removal. She shifted roles rather than stepping aside. If she could not be the bride, she would become the bridge. If she could not possess the name, she would infiltrate it. And the easiest route into a fortress was not to batter its walls. It was to walk in beside the person it had chosen to protect. Liana saw that ambition beneath the kindness like a blade beneath cloth. The blade did not need to be shown to be real. It only needed to remain close to the skin. Gideon Rowan also recalibrated, but in a different way. He had the talent of men who lived off reputation. He could look harmless while calculating damage. After Adrian's announcement, Gideon did not explode. He did not argue long. He did what he always did when confronted with power he could not openly resist. He absorbed the humiliation, swallowed it, and turned it into a plan. His public softness expanded, and his private control became more desperate. He began appearing where he normally avoided Liana. He sent servants to check if she needed anything. He referred to her with a politeness that sounded almost paternal, almost. It was never warm. Warmth required sincerity, and sincerity was a risk. Gideon's attention felt like a hand placed gently on a throat, not squeezing yet, but always reminding her what could happen. He spoke about the future in careful, neutral terms. He asked about her comfort. He asked about her health. He asked about what she might want to bring with her to Blackwood's residence. The questions sounded supportive if one listened from the outside. From the inside, they sounded like reconnaissance. Liana paid attention to the timing. Gideon's visits were not random. They appeared after certain letters arrived, after certain servants spoke with him, after the carriage returned from the harbor. It was as if Gideon's fear had begun to communicate with his greed, forming a thin alliance. Fear wanted safety. Greed wanted leverage. Both wanted Adrian's interest to be controllable. That was when the idea of Sullust as an escort began to appear in the household, like an odor you could not fully locate. It started as a suggestion thrown casually into conversation with servants. Sullust should accompany Liana to the Blackwood estate to help her adapt. Sullust could manage invitations. Sullust could help with etiquette. Sullust could support her sister in public. The words were shaped like kindness. The intention underneath was shaped like a key. Liana understood the strategy instantly. If Sullust went with her, Sullust would have access to Adrian's household. Sullust would have access to his staff, his routines, his weaknesses. She would learn the shape of his security. She would learn how he moved through his own space. In the Rowan world, access was power, and Gideon did not plan to surrender power just because someone else had announced ownership. Liana also understood something more personal. Sullust would not go to help. Sullust would go to compete. And competition, in that house, was not a game. It was a method of survival. While they played these polished games, Liana's attention moved to the parts of the house that still held unguarded truth. Drawers, cabinets, old correspondence, the forgotten pockets of the estate where documents were stored because no one believed she would dare to look. She did not begin searching out of curiosity. She began searching because she had seen the shifted pressure in the walls. She had felt the new urgency. If the house was tightening around her, it meant someone inside it believed time was running out. Time running out led to mistakes. Mistakes led to evidence. Liana moved carefully, never at the same time each day, never with a predictable route. Years of being watched had trained her to create patterns that looked like habits but were actually camouflage. She borrowed keys when they were left carelessly, not by accident, but because servants were human and human beings grew sloppy when they believed someone was powerless. She returned keys without leaving fingerprints. She opened drawers in rooms where the smell of perfume was thick enough to hide the scent of paper. The first things she found were ordinary. Invoices, lists of repairs, accounts that showed the house's financial strain masked behind expensive parties. The Rowan estate looked wealthy, but wealth was often a costume, and costumes required constant maintenance. There were late payments. There were debts disguised as investments. There were letters from creditors written in polite language that barely concealed threat. Then she found what she was not meant to find. It was not hidden in a safe. It was not locked behind a secret panel. It was in a folder placed among other folders, the way one hid something by burying it in plain sight. The folder's label was bland, meaningless. That was the first sign of intent. Gideon did not use bland labels unless he wanted something overlooked. Inside, there were copies of contracts and shipping manifests that did not match the official port records. Names appeared and disappeared. Signatures belonged to men who did not exist in public registries. Dates repeated like a pattern. Certain shipments were always delayed and then marked, received without details. Certain crates were listed as machinery parts and then insured for values that made no sense. Liana's hands remained steady even as something colder than fear started moving through her chest. It was not panic, it was recognition. Because among those documents was a piece of paper that carried her name. Not her nickname, not the cruel titles the town whispered. Her full name, written with formal precision. And beside it, a note that looked like an internal agreement, an arrangement that suggested her life had been assigned a direction long before Adrian entered the house. The language did not describe her as a daughter. It described her like an asset. There were references to transfer, to guardianship, to settlement. There was a mention of compensation connected to a date that lined up too closely with the fire that had changed her face. There were names she did not recognize, names attached to companies that did not exist in visible markets. There were initials that could have belonged to any number of men, but the presence of them next to her name made her skin feel as if it were remembering pain. The fire, which the family had always framed as tragedy, suddenly gained a new shape in her mind. Tragedies were convenient. Tragedies erased evidence. Tragedies turned questions into whispers and whispers into silence. If someone wanted to rewrite a person's life, a fire was an efficient ink. Liana did not allow herself to cry. She did not allow herself to tremble. Emotion would come later, maybe, when safety existed. In that moment, she let the discovery harden into something usable. The last thin hope she carried, that somewhere beneath the cruelty there was a family bond, did not shatter with drama. It simply vanished, like a candle extinguished without smoke. They had never seen her as family. They had seen her as a liability to hide, until she could be sold in a way that cleaned their hands. And now that Adrian had stepped in, their plan had been disrupted. Disruption did not create mercy. It created urgency. Liana returned the documents exactly as she found them. She did not take them, even though she wanted to. Taking them would alert Gideon. Gideon would tighten the house further. Instead, she memorized details, dates, names, patterns. She cuppaed key lines in her mind the way a person cuppaed a map when escape depended on it. She understood that evidence without context could be dangerous. She needed to know what it meant before she used it. And she needed to decide whom to trust with it, because trust was a weapon that could be turned. Outside the estate, Volmont's tone darkened. It began with small things that only someone attentive would notice. A car parked too long near the outer gate, its windows tinted, the engine off, as if the driver had nowhere else to be. Men walking the street in pairs, too coordinated for casual pescasba. A change in the harbor workers' routine. Fewer jokes, more silence, quick glances toward the water as if expecting something to surface. The Rowan family pretended not to notice. Pretending was their religion. But Liana had spent years being the person who existed outside the illusion, and people outside illusions learned to read shadows. The shadows around the house no longer felt like gossip. They felt like surveillance. She heard staff whisper about missing girls again, girls from the outskirts, girls from the orphanage near the industrial stretch where the city's moral concern stopped. Those rumors had always existed, but they usually moved through town like an uncomfortable draft, ignored by those who could afford to ignore. Now the rumors had sharper edges, as if someone had begun connecting them to specific nights, specific docks, specific ships. A short note appeared in the local paper about a disappearance. It was written like an inconvenience. A young woman not returned, last seen near a market, police asking for information. The article was small, tucked between advertisements and society updates. Volmont's priorities were visible even in print. The richer the reader, the smaller the missing girl. Liana read the note twice, then folded the paper and kept it. The name and description did not match anyone she knew, but the detail that mattered was location, near the docks controlled by men who did not advertise control, near the waterline where cargo could vanish without trace. The pattern in Gideon's documents and the pattern in the city's rumors began to align in her mind. The alignment formed a shape that was larger than her personal suffering. Her life was not an isolated cruelty. It was one tile in a mosaic built from other people's disappearances. That understanding did something strange. It made her fear smaller. Not because the danger reduced, but because it became understandable. A faceless monster was terrifying. A system was worse, but systems had weak points. Systems relied on routine. Systems relied on silence. Systems relied on people being too ashamed to speak. The Rowan house had been a small system. Volmont was a bigger one. And Adrian Blackwood, with his reputation and his cold control, had stepped into it like a blade designed for cutting through rot. Liana began watching Adrian differently. She had not seen him often since the announcement. He did not linger in the Rowan house longer than necessary, as if he refused to breathe their air unless it served a purpose. But his presence had left fingerprints everywhere. Staff walked strutta when his name was mentioned. Gideon's face tightened whenever someone referenced the Blackwood estate. Sullust's politeness grew sharper, like a smile hiding teeth. Liana noticed the way messages arrived. Sealed envelopes delivered by men who did not look like couriers. Short visits from unfamiliar guards who inspected the estate's perimeter without explaining themselves. The subtle movement of protection around her that was not romantic, not warm, but functional. Adrian's protection did not feel like a safe embrace. It felt like a boundary line drawn in iron. She recognized that he had not come to Volmont for a wedding alone. Weddings were public theater. Adrian looked like a man who used theater only as camouflage for operations that mattered. The engagement was his lever, but the lever was attached to something heavier than family politics. He was here for the port. He was here for the disappearing women. He was here for the deals that hid behind charity and investment. And he was here, whether he admitted it or not, because Liana was connected to those deals in a way that threatened to swallow her whole if she stayed passive. That reality forced her to change her own posture. She could no longer afford to be merely protected. A protected person could still be traded, still be removed, still be silenced if the protector turned away at the wrong moment. If she wanted survival that lasted beyond Adrian's attention, she needed agency. Agency did not have to look like rebellion. It could look like preparation. She began collecting small truths. She listened to which servants were loyal to Magana and which were loyal to Gideon. She noted which staff avoided Sullust's gaze and which leaned into it. She watched who entered the east wing without reason. She watched which drawers were opened in her absence. She inspected the locks on her door, the windows that did not open, the way air moved in her room as if even the house did not want her to breathe too freely. One night she found a faint smell of something unfamiliar near her tea service, an herbal edge that did not belong to the usual blends. She did not drink. She poured the tea into a basin and watched how it spread, how the scent rose. She remembered the phrase that had formed in her mind earlier. Poison could be brewed without changing color. She did not know if it was poison. She did not need certainty to be cautious. Caution was her oldest habit. She began eating only what she could verify. She accepted food from the kitchen only when she saw the cook prepare it. She took water from sealed bottles when possible. She kept her own small stash of items hidden, not out of paranoia, but out of realism. Realism had kept her alive longer than hope ever did. Sullust continued her smiling campaign. She began asking about Liana's interests as if she cared. She asked about painting as if she had ever respected it. She offered to help choose fabrics for dresses, to advise on appearances at Blackwood events, to protect Liana from society's cruelty. Each offer was shaped like companionship. Each carried a hook. Liana gave Sullust nothing. She responded politely, vaguely, never with enough detail to be used. Sullust's eyes hardened slightly each time she failed to get a real answer, but the smile stayed. The smile was the poison. It was poison not because it was fake, but because it was designed to make the victim doubt her own perception. If Sullust acted kind, then Liana's suspicion would look paranoid. If Liana rejected kindness, Then she would look bitter and unstable. It was a trap built to frame Liana regardless of what she chose. Liana refused to play the emotional part Sullust wanted from her. She did not become grateful. She did not become furious. She became unreadable. That unreadability unsettled Sullust more than tears ever would have. Tears were predictable. Anger was predictable. Silence, controlled silence, was the one thing the Rowan family had never managed to extract from her in a way they could sell. Gideon's urgency increased. He began pushing for timelines. When Liana would move to the Blackwood residence, what days she would be seen in public, which dinners would be attended. He spoke about logistics, but behind logistics was control. If he could influence the move, he could place people near her. If he could place Sullust near her, he could place eyes and hands inside Blackwood's walls. Liana saw Magunna's role in it too. Magunna's cruelty had always been cleaner than Sullust, more administrative. Magunna maintained the household's social face. Magunna punished without leaving marks when possible. Magunna now wore a sharper form of politeness, and her eyes tracked Liana the way one tracked an object that might be stolen before the transaction completed. One evening, while Magunna supervised a seamstress measuring Liana for a dress she had not asked for, Liana noticed how Magunna insisted on a higher collar, heavier fabric, more coverage. The justification was elegance, but Liana recognized the impulse. To hide, to control, to decide how much of Liana the world was allowed to see. Even after the engagement, Magunna still tried to keep Liana contained inside an acceptable frame. Liana allowed the measurements because refusing would create noise. Noise was dangerous, but she noted every decision. She noted the seamstress's hands shaking slightly, as if the seamstress feared someone's displeasure more than she feared making a mistake. Fear was always a sign of who truly held power in a room. As the days moved, the city's pressure pressed closer to the Rowan estate. At night, the sound of waves against the shore seemed louder, not because the sea changed, but because the mind sharpened under threat. The fog thickened some evenings until lamps outside the estate looked like blurred eyes. Cars without identification appeared again. Once, Liana saw a man smoking near the gate, his silhouette cut into the mist, his posture too relaxed for a stranger, too deliberate for a passerby. He did not approach. He only watched. Watching was often the first stage of taking. The Rowan family did not speak about it. Speaking would admit vulnerability. But Liana saw Gideon's servants adding extra locks, saw guards hired quietly for the night, saw Sullust's excitement sharpen into something almost hungry. A house under siege did not always unite. Sometimes siege revealed the cracks and made the inhabitants cannibalize one another for advantage. Liana's understanding of the larger mechanism deepened. She began to suspect the Rowan family was not merely complicit. They were connected. Whether they were architects or suppliers, she could not yet tell. But the documents and the city's whispers insisted on the same truth. The Rowan estate's wealth had shadows attached, and those shadows were not metaphor. By the end of that week, Liana stopped thinking of herself as merely someone escaping abuse. She began thinking of herself as someone standing at the junction of multiple interests. Adrian's investigation, the Rowan family's desperation, the port's hidden trade, Volmont's corrupt silence, Sullust's ambition. Each interest pulled at her in a different direction. Any one of them could crush her if she stayed passive. That was when she made an internal decision. She would not let the engagement be her only protection. She would become difficult to remove. Difficult did not mean loud. Difficult meant informed. Difficult meant prepared. Difficult meant having knowledge that made her valuable to the right person and dangerous to the wrong ones. She began writing again, not only painting. She used her sketches as a cover, but within them she mapped what she saw: the layout of corridors, the placement of locks, the patterns of guard changes, the times certain servants entered her wing. She hid notes within art because art was the one thing the household dismissed as harmless. People who underestimated her gave her room to gather power. Sullust's kindness continued, but it grew impatient. The smile remained, but the eyes began to show fatigue. It was exhausting to maintain poison without results. Sullust wanted reaction. Sullust wanted weakness. Sullust wanted Liana to slip. Liana did not slip. She waited. Because she understood something now with clarity that felt almost calm. The more Sullust smiled, the closer the bite. And when the bite came, Liana intended to be ready to decide whose blood it would draw. On the day of her departure, the Rowan house behaved as if nothing irreversible was happening. The walls retained their polished restraint, the corridors kept their measured silence, and the windows remained shut despite the mild weather, as they always had. This was a house that did not acknowledge endings. It preferred erasure to farewell. Liana left without ceremony. There were no embraces, no staged regrets, no last attempts at tenderness. She understood that goodbyes implied mutual recognition, and nothing in that house had ever been mutual. Her suitcase was light in weight but dense with meaning. Inside were the few objects she had decided to keep. The mask that had become both shield and boundary, several sketches folded carefully between layers of fabric, her mother's old ring worn smooth by time, and a narrow sheet of paper covered in numbers, dates, and intersections that should never have existed in a respectable family's records. She carried no illusions with her. She did not know whether the Blackwood estate would be freedom or a more refined confinement. But she knew, with complete clarity, that she would not remain where she had been shaped into something disposable. The car that took her away moved through Volmont without attracting attention. That in itself felt strange. For years she had been invisible by design. Now she was protected by intent. The streets slid past under a low ceiling of fog, salt clinging to stone and iron, the harbor breathing slowly like a patient animal. The city did not bless departures. It observed them and adjusted. The Blackwood estate rose above the water like a decision already made. It did not attempt charm. It did not invite admiration. The structure was built with purpose rather than display, its lines clean, its position deliberate. From the road, it looked less like a home and more like a boundary drawn in stone. Liana understood immediately why people referred to it as a fortress without irony. This was not a place that negotiated its authority. Adrian received her as if her arrival were not an event, but a continuation. There was no pause, no moment of assessment disguised as politeness. Everything about his manner communicated that the outcome had already been accounted for. He did not offer reassurance in the language of comfort. He offered structure. The rules were explained without embellishment. Who could enter? Who could not? Which parts of the estate were open and which remained sealed? How the staff rotated, how the security layers overlapped, how information moved and where it stopped. It was not a performance of care. It was infrastructure. Her safety was treated as a logistical certainty, not a favor. He did not ask her to remove the mask. He did not demand explanations. He did not rush intimacy under the guise of entitlement. Instead, he established a perimeter around her existence and made it clear that any attempt to breach it would be met without courtesy. Liana listened carefully. She had learned to measure people by what they protected and how they did it. Adrian protected by eliminating uncertainty. His control was not loud. It was thorough. Inside the estate, the atmosphere differed sharply from the Rowan house. There was no decorative excess, no curated warmth designed to distract from rot beneath. Everything served a function. Light fell where it was needed. Corridors were wide enough to move through without hesitation. Doors closed softly but completely. The staff did not avoid her gaze, nor did they linger. They acknowledged her presence and returned to their tasks. Respect here was procedural, not emotional. Her assigned rooms overlooked the water. From the window, She saw the port lights flicker through the fog, ships anchored like thoughts waiting to be acted upon. The city below seemed smaller from this height, its secrets compressed into patterns rather than chaos. For the first time, Liana saw Volmont not as a maze she was trapped inside, but as a system that could be mapped. She stood there for a long time, absorbing the shift. This place did not promise comfort. It promised leverage. That realization settled into her with unexpected calm. She understood that Adrian's world operated on a different axis than the Rowan house. There, power had been petty and defensive, exercised through fear of exposure and social consequence. Here, power was operational. It existed to produce results. It could protect, but it could also consume. The choice presented itself quietly, without drama. She could remain a symbol. The damaged girl rescued by influence, the fiancée whose presence justified a certain set of actions. That role would offer safety as long as it remained useful, or she could become integrated. She could learn how the fortress functioned, where its pressure points lay, how information flowed through it and out into the city. She could become someone who did not merely benefit from protection, but contributed to it. That path would cost more. It would demand clarity where she had once relied on endurance. It would require her to use what she knew about fear, silence, and transaction not as scars, but as tools. As night settled, the estate changed subtly. Guards shifted positions. Lights dimmed in some wings and sharpened in others. The sea pressed closer against the stone, its sound steady and indifferent. Liana unpacked slowly, placing each object with intention. She did not spread herself across the space. She claimed it carefully, leaving room to move. She thought of the Rowan house receding behind her, already adjusting to her absence. She knew they would not accept this loss quietly. Gideon's fear would calcify into strategy. Sullust's humiliation would ferment into obsession. Debts did not disappear simply because a valuable asset had been removed from reach. They would search for leverage, for angles, for ways to reinsert themselves into the narrative. Adrian was already moving. His attention had shifted outward, toward the port, toward records that had never been meant to align, toward disappearances that had been written off as accidents or misfortune. The engagement provided cover. The investigation provided momentum. Together, they formed something dangerous. Liana understood that her presence here did not end the conflict. It escalated it. She stood at the window again as the fog thickened, pressing her palm briefly against the cold glass. The reflection that looked back at her was fragmented, layered with lights and water and shadow. She did not look away. She was no longer being hidden. She was being positioned. The world beyond the fortress would not be gentle in response. Attempts would be made to discredit her, provoke her, break her publicly rather than quietly. The mask that had once marked her as shame would now be treated as challenge. She welcomed the clarity of that shift. If they intended to test her, she would ensure the test changed them as well. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.